Disruption webinar with Rich Cowles from the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. I'm Mary Concklin from University of Connecticut. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about mating disruption. What is it? Does it work? Which I can tell you right now they do. And is it for you? And we'll give you some economic information in here as well, and you can make that decision. We're recording this webinar, and it will be up on the UConn IPM website sometime later this week. So right now I'm going to turn this over to Rich Cowles, and he's going to take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Mary. I hope everybody can hear me. And I'd like to thank Mary for inviting me to participate with this presentation. Next slide. Yeah, a lot of insects use chemicals to communicate with each other. And in the case of both moths and beetles, you see a very common phenomenon is that the females will produce a chemical odor, almost like a perfume that wafts downwind, and then males pick up on that odor and they'll fly upwind to find a female to mate with. Now, I chose the two most visually arresting images I could of a female on the left here, where she has turned inside out these sex pheromone producing glands, and it's releasing the chemicals into the air. And on the right, you see the extreme adaptation in a lot of moths, but you also see in beetles too, that the males that are responding to pheromones tend to have much larger antennae than the females of the same species. So that sometimes can be a cue that a certain species uses sex pheromones to find their mates. So the sexually receptive female releases the sex pheromones, and then the male orients by flying upwind and maintains contact with that odor plume until he reaches her. And oftentimes that odor plume is discontinuous. There's a little vortices in the wind, and that odor is broken up into little pieces. So the male has to be able to cast back and forth until he picks up that odor trail again, and then he uses his vision to be able to orient to continually fly upwind while he is in contact with the sex pheromone aroma. And the way that mating disruption works, actually there are two mechanisms, one of which is shown on the left here, which there may be competitive attraction. The male moth will fly to a pheromone dispenser rather than to the female, and he'll try to go through his courtship rituals with an artificial pheromone dispenser rather than an authentic female. On the right, you see a different mechanism in which there's a disruption of the normal response by the males. So the male is flying upwind, and if you have enough dispensers and you realize that each one of these is producing a plume that's discontinuous, he'll continue when he loses contact of the aroma of casting back and forth, and then he'll pick up maybe the odor trail from a different dispenser, and so he'll just be totally confused and cannot orient upwind really to anything. Next. Now, I have to get into the weeds a little bit here with respect to the chemistry of pheromones, because it's important for something we'll be covering very shortly. We have a leader in the state in pheromone chemistry, and that's Dr. Bedukian from Bedukian Research down in Waterbury. And he worked very closely with US EPA back in the 1980s and maybe early 90s to allow pheromones of certain chemical classes to be exempt from tolerance by US EPA. So if you have a sex-attractant pheromone that's either an alcohol, an aldehyde, or an ester, EPA looked at the quantity of these chemicals that would be released, and they looked at the chemical reactivity of these groups, and they said, you know what, there's not really anything to be concerned about with respect to human exposure to these chemicals. And so EPA has basically set a blanket exemption from tolerance for the use of pheromones that are in those particular classes from undergoing really rigorous testing in terms of animal safety and safety to humans. Ketones, on the other hand, are actually, many of them are very worrisome in terms of their toxicity. Those are not exempt from tolerance. Next. The reason why this is relevant is that we have several important white grub species here in Connecticut. The two on the lower part of the slide, the one on the lower left is Japanese beetle, the one on the lower right is the Oriental beetle. Both of those have sex-attractant pheromones that involve ketones. Next. Now, these are important in fruit crops because the larvae feed on the roots of strawberries and blueberries, and probably our other fruit crops as well. Japanese beetle tend to be only present where there are grasses, which would attract the females to lay their eggs. Oriental beetle oftentimes will lay their eggs, especially in drought years, where there's an irrigated field and where there's a high amount of organic matter. So you can think about strawberry plantings or blueberry plantings as being really major targets for egg laying by Oriental beetle. Next. And unfortunately, in 2013, the use of conventional insecticide to control white grubs in strawberries, and that insecticide was imidacloprid, failed. And that led us to really look at opportunities to use different methods to manage this particular pest. Growers who have managed Oriental beetle in their strawberry plantings have found that the plants are much more productive. Oops, I just lost my screen. Just a moment. Okay, there we go. Next. Well, thankfully, a colleague of mine, a very brilliant man, Dr. Leal, while he was working in a postdoc, I think, in Japan, identified the sex pheromone of Oriental beetles. And if you look at the lower left corner of the compound, you'll see that it is a ketone. And so this is a sex pheromone that cannot be simply dispensed over the whole field. Rather, in order to use this kind of a pheromone, it has to be presented, next slide, as a removable dispenser, something that can be set out into the field and then retrieved again later if you really wanted to. This shows a different color morph of Oriental beetle and a couple different types of mating disruption pheromone dispensers in the lower left, and one of the hanging dispensers being used in a blueberry planting in the lower right. These were tested very extensively, this pheromone, by Sridhar Polavarapu, Albrecht Koppenhofer, Dean Polk, and Cesar Rodriguez Sayona, all of whom work for Rutgers University. Between 1998 and 2012, they demonstrated very clearly that the sex-attracted pheromone for Oriental beetle can be used in any type of situation where Oriental beetle are a problem. From turf to blueberries, it's a very useful technology. Next. One thing I'd like to mention to everybody is if you're handling dispensers for pheromones or pheromones in any way, you really need to be careful, not really necessarily for your chemical safety to wear nitrile gloves when handling them, but from the awkwardness that might come about from absorbing the pheromones into your body. If you handle these pheromones indiscriminately and you absorb the pheromone through your skin, they'll be absorbed into your fat and then will turn you into a lifetime pheromone emitter. And so every year, for example, one colleague of mine used to work with gypsy moth pheromones, and I know when gypsy moth males are flying because every year they're male moths flying into our building looking for her. So for the Oriental beetle mating disruption product, you would be hanging 20 to 40 dispensers per acre in a grid pattern, 1 to 2 feet high, as soon as you've seen any adults. And then the pheromone will last 60 days, which is the entire time that Oriental beetle would be active. Next, the reason why Oriental beetle mating disruption works feeds into the biology of this particular beetle, one of which is that the males only mate once per day, and then the females rarely travel far from where they emerge. And this is important for any mating disruption. If you're trying to do mating disruption in an orchard, and you have an abandoned orchard nearby that's providing a source of mated moths, let's say codling moths, then mating disruption isn't going to work very well, because if you have a source for mated females, they'll orient to your trees and lay eggs on your fruit, and that's basically defeating the whole strategy. So since the females don't travel far from where they emerge, that means that you can use these dispensers over a field, and you don't have to worry about an influx of mated females coming in to make your efforts worthless. The pheromone is simple. There's only a single compound, and so it was easy for the manufacturer to synthesize. And typical for pheromones, only 1 to 2 grams per acre of the active ingredient, or pheromone, are needed per year for shutting down the ability of females to be mated. Next. And this is in stark contrast to Japanese beetles. The pheromones don't work for their management. Next. You're probably all familiar with bag-a-bug or other Japanese beetle pheromone traps. Those are problematic because they have both a floral lure and a sex attractant lure. And what happens is that beetles that are orienting to that combination of aromas will simply stop along the way in that odor plume for where they reach any edible plant, and they'll simply stop on that plant and start eating it. Now, if people had formulated the Japanese beetle pheromones as simply the sex attractant pheromone, they probably could be deployed in the same way as we use Oriental beetle mating disruption. However, the Japanese beetle females also tend to be much more mobile than Oriental beetle, and so it would be likely to fail based upon the immigration of mated females into a field that we would wish to protect. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Mary now.
So I'm going to talk about some of the borers that we have in our fruit crops, and the first one is the Dogwood Borer. This is a clearwing moth. It overwinters in the tree as a larva, and then in the springtime, the larva pupates. The female will emerge in late May and into July, and she lays her eggs on the bark near an opening or of a wound or a burr knot, because those are the aerial roots. The reason is that the larva just can't penetrate intact bark. So on the lower right, you see a burr knot there, and you see a little larva coming out. The larva will then tunnel into the cambium tissue where they feed. And so once in the tree, it is extremely difficult to control them. They're in a protected environment. So once these larvae move in, if you try to spray for them, nothing's going to happen. Then again, inside that burr knot or inside that wound, then the larva will stay there and they'll pupate again the next spring, and the whole cycle begins again. So we can monitor and we can manage these. We can first of all, avoid wounding the tree any way we can, but we also really need to focus in on these burr knots. You need to be aware of them, recognize that there are numerous of them, particularly on malling and malling-Merton rootstocks. You know, a long time ago, trees were planted with a graft union just above the soil line, so we still had some burr knots, but we had fewer of them. Times have changed, planting systems have changed, and now the rootstock is out of the ground by as much as 6 to 8 inches, leaving more burr knots that are exposed. So these Burr Knots, when they are planted into the ground with as part of that rootstock, will become roots. But when they're not and they're exposed to the air, they're just like aerial roots, and they're openings. So there was a practice a long time ago as well of using a rasp to file down the Burr Knots, believing this would reduce problems with Dogwood Borer. But there's still an opening, and it was labor intensive. So that isn't even something we even consider anymore. We can paint the trunk with a white latex paint. That works very well at repelling these insects. They don't lay their eggs through that one, so we have a lot less of a problem with them. The other is a trunk spray, and that has to be done before the larvae enter the tree, because again, once they're in, you're not going to attack it. So Laura's Band has been the one we've used for a long, long time. It works very well. A sale is also labeled for it, not quite as good, but it does work well. So you're really looking at targeting that trunk about half-inch green to petal fall, and then probably again in early July. This is labor-intensive too, because oftentimes it's done with a handgun and someone is walking along and looking at where these things are. So the other option is to use a mating disruptor. So we use the ISOMATE DWB, which is Dogwood Borer, 100 to 150 ties per acre. The first year, you really want to go with that higher end, closer to the 150, to make sure you try to get them knocked down. And also, if you know you have a high population, we want to work on that one. After the first year, oftentimes you can drop down to 100 to 125. These are twist ties. You put them in the trees about chest height. I realize that's kind of a variable rate here, but you're looking at maybe 4.5, 5.5 feet high off the ground. Place them evenly throughout the block because you want that pheromone to be dispensed all over. And again, hang it prior to adult emergence, because if I wait and hang them after the adults have emerged, after they've mated and laid the eggs, it obviously is not going to work. Once these are in the tree, it's season-long control. You don't need to worry about it again. And then you rehang some new ones the following year. While we're having these up there, we also need to monitor our population of Dogwood Borer. So there are traps and lures you can put out there. You also need to start looking for pupil cases protruding from the Burr Knots. And here's I don't have a picture of that one, sorry. And then you also can look for frass around the Burr Knot. You can see where they're coming out. So these are great ways to work, and this does work very, very effectively. I'll get into the cost a little later. So moving on to peachtree borer and lesser peachtree borer, we do have a mating disruptor that takes care of both of them in one. So they're similar, but they're also very different insects. So the peachtree borer has 1 generation per year. Lesser peachtree borer has 2. They both do lay their eggs on the tree, on the bark. The peachtree borer is around the soil line and maybe about 6 to 8 inches above. The lesser peachtree borer is really attracted to wounds and goes just about anywhere on the tree, but usually further up the trunk and out on the limbs. The emergence for both of these is around shuck split, which is really, in our time, around late May, early June. So then they will overwinter as larvae in the trees in these wounds, and then the adults will again emerge the following spring. So you can see in this picture on the left, it's peachtree borer. Peachtree borers usually do not attack trees that are less than 2 inches in diameter, but you can see this peach tree is just a little bit above that, and it's shot. When you look at the number of holes that are in there, the number of borers in there, there's no way that that tree is going to recover from this one. And on the right is the lesser peach tree. You can see that damage there as well. There's at least 2 right in the center, and then there's some further up on the left as well. So we want to inspect the base of the tree for the peach tree borer for frass, sawdust, and that's going to be like July through mid-August. Examine the soil also next to the trees for any cocoons or empty pupil casings that may have fallen. For the lesser peach tree borer, examine the wounds on the upper trunk, the limbs, and you can look for the pupil cases on the tree as well. They're not going to be down on the soil, and you'll be able to see how many you have there. After you're doing all that, we can use trunk sprays beginning around shuck split. With lesser peach tree borer, you're going to be using more than one. So Laura's Band, again, when we look at these kinds of borers, is the best one. Although for these we have Warrior, Gladiator, besiege, and indigo that are also highly rated against both of these borers. So you do have options. Because remember, Laura's Band is one application per year, and it's got a 28-day pre-harvest interval on it, whereas Warrior, Gladiator, Besiege, and Indigo, you don't have those types of restrictions on them. So we can use the mating disruptor here also. It's an ISOMATE PTV dual, so it takes care of both peach tree borer and lesser peach tree borer. 100 to 250 ties per acre. 250 is, again, we go the high rate at the beginning of the first year we try to do it. Generally, you can get away with dropping that down to, say, 150, maybe even 100 the second year and subsequent years after that. They need to be in place no later than chuck split. Again, we want them in ahead of when the females will be flying. Chest height again, uniform pattern all the way around, and these give us season-long control. What the company has found and other researchers have found that if you have at least 5-acre block or larger, it works much better. Now, it will work on an acre block. I've seen it work on those, but the larger area you have, the better. So if you have 2 different peach blocks, you really need to do mating disruption in both, because otherwise, as Rich mentioned before, if you only do it in one and you don't do it in the other, you can get mating occurring in one block, and then they'll move over to the other block as well. So the last one I want to talk about is the codling moth and the Oriental fruit moth. Again, these 2 insects are different, but they have some similarities. Codling moth only has 2 generations per year. Oriental fruit moth has 3 to 4 generations per year, so we want to take care of that one for a longer span. They both do overwinter as larvae, either in the tree, under the bark scales, or on the ground in leaf litter. They emerge as adults in the springtime, usually around the bloom period. And here's where a difference comes in. The codling moth the larva will feed on the fruit, whereas with the Oriental fruit moth, that first generation larvae go into the terminals and feed on those, and then the subsequent generations will then feed on the fruit. So you can see the damage here up on the upper right is the Oriental fruit moth with that first generation, where they will feed, they will lay the egg in there. It enters the leaf axis near the tip of the shoot, bores down into the center for several inches, and it causes wilting and eventually the death of the tip. And then the later generations on the upper left, where they also start then feeding on the fruit, and they then burrow down into the fruit towards the core. Codling moth are the bottom 2 pictures. Both generations only feed on the fruit, and you can see the frass that they leave, and that's a telltale sign that it's codling moth if you look for that frass on the fruit. So when we're monitoring, we do need to hang out traps and lures, and you need to have one for each. You can see the difference between the codling moth and Oriental fruit moth, although I will tell you when they've been on the trap for a while, they tend to look a little similar, so you need to look at the bands on them as well. The color is not always quite that distinct as you see in these pictures, so you look at the bands and you know which one you'll have out there. So we can use mating disruption, and this is not a tie, this is a loop, and it will take care of both the codling moth and the Oriental fruit moth. Again, they need to go out ahead of the females flying, so we want them out between pink and petal fall at the absolute latest. The codling moth is season long, even though it has fewer generations. The Oriental fruit moth pheromone will last about 90 days, but that will get you through August. So you're usually pretty good on that one anyway, and I haven't seen any problems from having it only 90 days long. The way the moth flies is they come in high. So for this one, we're looking at the top third of the tree or the upper 2 to 3 feet on that tree. So the best way to put these up there, as you can see on the left, is using a PVC pipe where you kind of insert it and hang it up high. It's a little bit more labor intensive than the ties, but if you put those down lower on the tree, you're going to see damage from both the codling moth and or the Oriental fruit moth higher up in the tree. So put those things higher up. 200 per acre. Doesn't matter if it's the first year or the 5th year. It's 200 of these loops per acre, evenly distributed, but a little heavier on the border. And then again, we put traps out there to monitor for these things. Because if you get nothing in the traps, then we have trap shutdown, and that means that these are working. But that first year, particularly if you know you've had heavy infestations in the past, if you're getting about 5 codling moth in a trap, you're going to need to come in with a chemical at the beginning just to get those knocked down. About 10 moths in a trap for Oriental fruit moth, and you'll need to do the same thing. So here's just showing you what we did for the Oriental fruit moth and codling moth. So on the right is, we're up in the upper third of the tree with that loop, and then we also are hanging our trap farther up too to catch them up there. So these are all fine and dandy. We know that these things all work, but what about the cost? So in 2017, the prices for the Peachtree Borer, lesser Peachtree Borer ISOMATE were $237 a pack. You're putting up about 100 to 250 per acre. So if you're putting up 150 per acre, it's going to cost you $72 per acre for the mating disruptors plus the labor involved in putting them up. The codling moth or Oriental fruit moth ones are $285 for a pack of 400, which covers 2 acres because it's $200 per acre no matter what year you're in. A little bit more expensive for those, and your labor is going to be a little bit higher because you're reaching so much higher up in the tree. You're not just walking around quickly twisting a tie on. And the Dogwood Borer price is very similar to the Peachtree Borer. So if you look at those prices per acre, then you can then start plugging in your labor costs and figure out what it's going to cost you. So about a little over 10 years ago in Massachusetts, they did work with the Peachtree Borer and lesser Peachtree Borer covering 12 acres. So remember, these prices are from back at that time. So for Laura's band, plus the labor, plus the equipment, it would have cost $1,719. And then for the mating disruptor, plus the labor to put them out there, was $844. But the difference was $955. Clearly, that's quite a big savings out there, and it's well worth doing it. In Michigan, they did a study with codling moth. You can buy the ISOMATE for codling moth alone. I'd suggest you buy it for the codling moth or Oriental fruit moth combined just to take care of both of them. So in Michigan, they had a 60% reduction in chemical usage and the number of sprays and a huge reduction in codling moth injury. What they didn't say was what put dollars to that. So I can't tell you what the dollars were. But they did find a lot of reductions in that one. So where can you buy these? From your distributor. So anybody who works with Helena Chemical or Crop Production Services, you can purchase them. Keep in mind, as the company told me that produces these things, the Broadbrook Crop Production Services does not buy the mating disruptors from the company. However, if you went to them, they could probably get them from either the Massachusetts or the New York CPS building. For the ones that Rich talked about, the Oriental Beetle mating disruptor, that's from a different company. That's from AgBio, and you need to go directly to them to get that. Great Lakes IPM. I know I've had a number of growers go on there. A lot of people buy their equipment from them for IPM, and they do have mating disruptors. But if you go on that website, you'll notice they do not list Connecticut or any New England state, for that matter, having them labeled. These are labeled in Connecticut and in the rest of New England, but you cannot purchase them through Great Lakes IPM. There's some thing they have with their distributors, so you can't purchase those from them. You can get the lures and the traps for monitoring from Great Lakes IPM, but you cannot get the mating disruptors from them. So just some final thoughts on mating disruption. It does influence the male insect, the behavior of them. You know, we're playing with the male psyche and sex, so that makes it kind of fun. There is no negative impact on beneficials or on bees. So for a lot of these chemicals we have now, there's bee information on it. These do not attract them. There's absolutely no impact. There's no restricted entry interval after you apply them, and there's no pre-harvest interval as far as restrictions when they're out there. You don't have to remove them that season. They can stay on until you end up pruning them out. For those who are running organic operations, these are OMRI approved, but even though they are organic, as Rich mentioned, wear gloves. It's on the label, so wear the gloves. These work best in a lot of situations with at least 5 acres. Now, not necessarily for the strawberry one, for the Oriental Beetle. I don't believe there's a 5-acre on that one. Mating disruptors must be in place before the flight of the females begins. Otherwise, you're going to find damage and you're going to see a failure on this from working. Use the labeled rate. That first year, particularly to knock them down and where you may have had a high population, go with a higher end. Don't go with a low rate. By the second year, you should probably be able to knock that down either midway back or down to the low end on them. It's important that you monitor as you go along, whether it's looking for the frass, looking on the ground, looking on the trees, or putting out traps and lures. For Concklin moth, Oriental fruit moth, it's really important to put the traps and the lures out to make sure that these are shutting down before you find any damage in the fruit. And then remember that this first year, if you have a high population from historical perspectives, you may need to come in with a chemical control that first year as these populations are being knocked down. Generally, that's not needed after the first year, but that first year, in some cases, it is needed. And evaluate the cost on your farm. You know what it costs to run your equipment. You know what your labor expenses are. I've given you the prices for the mating disruptors as of last year. I'm not sure their price is probably going to go up this much this year at all. But look at that. Look at what your chemical costs are, and then you can decide whether this is going to work for you. For most places, growers love these things. Once they start them and it works, they stick with it. So it's not something you want to do 1 or 2 years and then say, forget it, I'm not going to do it anymore. But once you start it, keep doing it, and then you will find a great reduction in a lot of your chemical controls on there. Also, never let the populations get away from you. Remember that. So that's, again, a key to timing on putting these out. Put them out as early as you can. They last all season long, so you don't have to worry about timing it close to weather events. Okay, and with that, we'll open this up to any questions. If you have them in the chat box, Rich and I will be able to answer them. I can't see the chat box. Maybe Mackenzie can share what they are.
Yep, I can see them.
Okay. Again, this will be recorded. It has been recorded and will be put up on the UConn IPM website if you want to see it again. So if we don't have any questions, thank you very much for joining us.
Hold on. Wait a minute. So Bob Vance just said, I take it that there aren't any mating disruptors from plum curculio. How far they fly.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. Plum curculio has been a very difficult insect to trick through behavioral means, and I'm not aware that the sex pheromone has been identified or been taken advantage of. Oftentimes in weevils, they have what are called aggregation pheromones. That's something I'd have to look into, but no, there aren't any mating disruption tools available for plum curculio.
And then there's another question. Are all MD products OMRI approved?
Yes, it's at this point.
Okay, and she said PTB and LPTB2.
Yeah, so the Peachtree Borer, lesser Peachtree Borer, is one lure with pheromones for both. So it's the PTB dual, and it covers both of them, and that is OMRI approved. Any other questions?
Don't see any more yet. Another minute or two, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I can mention, I think that the mating disruption for Oriental Beetle costs about $75 for the pheromone plus the labor.
Is that per acre, Rich?
Yeah, I'm sorry, per acre.
Per acre.
And I am a little bit surprised that in Connecticut, growers have only used them for managing Oriental Beetle in strawberries, whereas I'm sure that they're used extensively for control of Oriental Beetle in blueberries, for example, in New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Rich, for participating in this with us, and thank you, Mackenzie, for being my wingman on this.
You're
You're welcome.
Enjoy the snow.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.